The morning air was sharp with the scent of pine and freshly cut grass as I stepped outside to check the mail. Our neighborhood, Lake Ranch Estates, was nestled between a dense forest and a wide, tranquil lake, picturesque us, but not without its drama. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows across the cul-de-sac where only the squirrels were active. My boots crunched softly on the gravel as I approached the community mailbox, my hoodie pulled tight against the crisp chill. I never expected that something so mundane would kick off the most absurd encounter of my life. The envelope I held was a notice from the HOA again. It was the fourth one this month, each more ridiculous than the last. This time, they claimed I had violated lawn color regulations. I chuckled, flipping the paper over to see the signature. At the bottom, Karen D. Kessler, president of the HOA. Her name had become infamous in the neighborhood, synonymous with nitpicking and power trips. This was no ordinary HOA member. This was Karen in full command. Karen had a reputation for patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart, clipboard in hand, sunglasses always perched high on her nose. She took her role as HOA president far beyond anything the bylaws required. Her latest initiative involved mandatory face-to-face compliance discussions at the Lake Ranch office. No one enjoyed these meetings. They were traps, filled with veiled threats and passive-aggressive remarks. I had already skipped to now. She was demanding a third. I had better things to do than sit through another hour of Karen's bureaucratic ego trip. I crumpled the notice and tossed it into the recycling bin, resisting the urge to add a middle finger for good measure. The rules stated I was entitled to written warnings before any fines or penalties. Karen, however, believed in scare tactics. Her last voicemail had ended with a snarl, "Refuse again, and I'll take this to the authorities." My phone buzzed. As I walked back inside, another call from an unknown number. I let it ring out. Moments later, a voicemail popped up. Curiosity got the better of me, and I hit play. Her voice crackled through the speaker, sharp and rehearsed. "You've ignored my requests. I'm calling the sheriff if you don't show up by noon." I laughed, not because it was funny, but because she had no idea who she was dealing with. She was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Most people in town knew my last name. They'd seen it stenciled on patrol cars and stitched into uniforms for over a decade. My dad, Sheriff Mark Tannen, had served the county faithfully, known for his calm demeanor and iron sense of justice. Growing up as his son meant I had an unspoken shield, but I never abused it. Still, there were moments, like this one, when knowing the sheriff personally had its advantages. Especially when someone tried to play legal hardball. The clock ticked past noon. I stayed home reading on the porch, sipping coffee and waiting for the fallout. At exactly 12:14 p.m., I saw her golf cart pull up across the street. She wore a red blazer, gold-rimmed sunglasses, and an expression of theatrical outrage. She stared at my house, then down at her phone, lips moving rapidly. Within seconds, I saw her dial a number. My curiosity shifted to anticipation. I knew what was coming. Minutes later, the familiar rumble of a county patrol SUV echoed down the street. It was surreal watching it pull into my driveway as Karen stood triumphantly nearby, arms folded. She waved to the deputy like she was welcoming an old friend. I stood to greet them, suppressing a smirk. The deputy stepped out, Deputy Reyes, a longtime family friend. His eyes met mine, and a slow grin spread across his face. "Hey Caleb," he said, nodding. "What's the situation here?" Karen's jaw slackened slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. "This young man is refusing to comply with HOA mandates," she announced, her voice dripping with self-importance. Reyes raised an eyebrow. I crossed my arms, casually leaning against the porch rail. "You mean the HOA meeting I wasn't legally required to attend?" I asked. Karen's confidence wavered for the first time. She glanced between us, suddenly less, but sure of herself. "He's been warned multiple times. He's being hostile," she insisted. Reyes turned to me. "Hostile?" I held up my coffee mug. "I was just reading a book and enjoying my morning." Reyes sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Karen calling 911 for non-emergencies isn't a good look," he said. The silence was delicious. Karen sputtered, trying to reframe the situation. "I didn't call 911 exactly. I contacted the sheriff's office because this is a matter of authority." Reyes crossed his arms. "And now you're wasting county resources over a neighborhood dispute." I could almost hear the gears grinding in her head. She hadn't expected this response. Her face flushed crimson. I took a long sip of coffee, then set it down deliberately. "Karen, just so you know, I'm Sheriff Tannen's son." Her eyes widened in slow motion, as if the air had been sucked out of her lungs. Her voice caught. "You're who?" I nodded. Reyes chuckled. "Yeah, and trust me, the sheriff doesn't take kindly to 911 misuse." Karen stood frozen, processing the revelation like someone hit with a legal brick. She began to stammer, her earlier bravado melting. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said weakly. "I just wanted to ensure community compliance." Reyes stepped forward, his tone firmer now. "Ma'am, we're going to need to document this call. Misuse of emergency services is a chargeable offense." Karen backed up, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. Her power trip had just run out of gas. Neighbors had started peeking from behind curtains. One even stepped onto their lawn to film the encounter. Karen noticed, her eyes darting nervously. The red blazer she wore seemed to radiate heat, sweat beading along her hairline. She turned to me, attempting a weak smile. "I suppose we can resolve this amicably, can't we?" I returned her smile, all teeth. "Sure, let's just follow the rules next time." Reyes walked her back to her golf cart, offering a few stern parting words. She climbed in without another word, peeling away with much less swagger than when she arrived. I watched until she disappeared around the corner. Reyes shook his head and chuckled. "You always find yourself in the weirdest messes, man." I shrugged. "I don't find them, they find me." The rest of the afternoon passed without incident, though my phone buzzed a dozen times with texts from neighbors. Apparently, I had become a local legend. A few even offered beers in solidarity. Karen's empire of control had cracked if only slightly, but the bigger story wasn't the power she lost. It was the way she underestimated the quiet ones, especially the ones with backup. That evening I sat down with my dad on the back porch. The sunset painted the lake in hues of fire and gold. He listened calmly as I recounted the events, nodding occasionally, a slight grin tugging at his lips. "She really called us?" he asked, amused. I nodded, didn't even blink when she threatened to. He sipped his iced tea, then said, "Reyes handled it well, but keep your cool. People like that want you to react." His words stayed with me. It was tempting to gloat, to post the video, to rub it in, but he was right. The best response was calm, visible confidence. Let others record and share if they wanted. I didn't need to prove anything. Karen had done that for me. Her meltdown had exposed her methods better than any argument could, and I wasn't done yet. This wasn't over. The next HOA newsletter arrived 2 days later. Strangely, it didn't mention my name or the incident, but the language had shifted, less aggressive, more formal, and filled with phrases like voluntary compliance and community cooperation. I smiled as I read it, sipping my morning coffee once again. Karen had been humbled, but I knew better than to assume she was finished. No, this was just the beginning. Behind every policy and warning notice, behind every passive-aggressive note taped to a mailbox, there was a person. Someone drunk on control, emboldened by a little laminated ID and a title. But when that authority meets real accountability, that's where things get interesting. Karen wasn't going to back down quietly, but neither was I. As twilight settled over Lake Ranch Estates, I couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation. This clash wasn't over, it was evolving. A cold war between a self-appointed queen and the sheriff's son. And in a place like this, where appearances mattered more than truth, I had the one thing she couldn't fake: credibility. Let her file reports, let her leave voicemails, let her call in reinforcements. I was ready. I had the patience of a lawman's son and the receipts to match. Chapter 1 had been her move. Chapter 2 would be mine, and it was going to be spectacular. 2 days after the standoff, Lake Ranch Estates buzzed with gossip. Word had spread like wildfire, fueled by the neighbor who caught the whole thing on video. Karen had tried to shut it down, issuing a cease and desist to anyone who shared the footage, but the internet doesn't care about HOA memos. Within hours, the video had been clipped, memed, and shared in 3 different neighborhood Facebook groups. I tried to keep a low profile, but that proved impossible. At the local coffee shop, someone paid for my order and winked. The barista scrawled legend on my cup in permanent marker. As I walked out, a couple whispered, "That's the sheriff's kid." It was surreal. I hadn't done anything heroic, I just didn't fold under pressure. But in this place, standing up to Karen made you a folk hero. Karen, however, wasn't licking her wounds in silence. No, she was regrouping. I saw her the next day, cruising in her golf cart with a stack of folders in her lap. Her sunglasses were bigger than ever, and her posture screamed damage control. She waved at everyone, smiling too widely, trying to reclaim control of the narrative. It was like watching a politician during a scandal, part denial, part overcompensation. That evening I received a certified letter. It was hand-delivered by a teenager who looked both terrified and confused. I signed for it and opened it slowly. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA. Karen had filed a formal complaint against me for public defamation, failure to comply with HOA ethics, and my personal favorite, hostile nonverbal behavior. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped. The language was dramatic, full of legal-sounding jargon that fell apart under scrutiny. She cited bylaws with no numbers, claimed eyewitness accounts without names, and accused me of inciting rebellion. It read more like a screenplay than a legal document. Still, I knew I had to respond. Ignoring her would only embolden her. I needed to show her I wasn't going to be intimidated by paper. My dad always said, "Never meet aggression with noise, meet it with facts." So I printed the HOA bylaws, highlighted the sections she misquoted, and prepared a calm, professional rebuttal. I copied the board, attached a timeline of events, and included a transcript of her voicemail. I even added a note at the end: "Respectfully, please review the law before invoking it." It was the most satisfying email I'd ever sent. 3 days passed, no response. Then, on Sunday, the HOA held a surprise meeting. A bulletin was taped to every mailbox. Community emergency session. The language was vague, but everyone knew what it was about. The clubhouse overflowed with residents, most attending for the first time. Folding chairs were set up hastily, and the mood was electric. Karen took the stage like it was a presidential address. She cleared her throat and began a speech filled with vague terms like community disruption and undermined order. Her voice trembled slightly, whether from nerves or fury, I couldn't tell. She never said my name, but every word pointed at me. People exchanged glances. A few rolled their eyes, some even chuckled. It was clear her grip on power was slipping, but she wasn't done yet. Then she proposed something outrageous, a motion to revise the HOA bylaws to include stricter conduct codes and mandatory compliance reviews. Translation: more power for her, less autonomy for everyone else. She called it the Neighborhood Integrity Initiative. Someone in the back muttered, "This isn't the UN." A murmur of dissent rippled through the crowd. Karen didn't notice, or pretended not to. I raised my hand. Karen hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. I stood and addressed the crowd calmly. "If we're talking integrity, let's start with transparency. How about we record all HOA meetings and make them public?" The room erupted. Some clapped. A few stood in support. Karen's face turned the color of her signature red blazer. She gavelled the meeting to order, but the damage was done. Afterward, neighbors came up to me with encouragement. About time someone stood up to her. One woman said, "We've all been scared of crossing her." Another man added, "She's been getting away with this for years." You flipped the script. I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the community reclaiming its voice. Karen had ruled through fear. That reign was crumbling. Then next week brought more paperwork. Karen submitted a code enforcement report accusing me of illegal porch furniture, improper mailbox spacing, and unauthorized wind chimes. I half expected her to cite me for excessive breathing. I responded with photographs, timestamps, and polite rebuttals. I copied the entire board again. The silence from Karen was telling she wasn't winning. She was flailing. Then came the anonymous letters, slipped under my door, taped to my car. Notes that said things like, "You're making it worse," or "She's not someone you want to fight." They were typed, unsigned, and meant to rattle me. I brought them to my dad. He read each one slowly, then filed them away in a folder labeled Karen Saga. He smiled and said, "The louder they get, the more scared they are." My mom, ever the tactician, suggested a different route. "Host a block party," she said. "Show them you're not just fighting, you're building something." It was genius. I printed invites, handed them out with a grin, and promised music, barbecue, and open conversation. Karen received one too, hand-delivered with a smile. She blinked like I'd offered her a snake. "It's a community event," I said sweetly. The night of the party, the street transformed. Lights strung between porches, tables lined with potluck, dishes, kids darting around with glow sticks. Music played, laughter echoed, and for the first time in a long while, people felt like neighbors. I gave a short speech thanking everyone for coming, stressing unity and shared respect. The applause was real. The sense of relief, even more so. Karen showed up late, wearing pearls and an expression of forced politeness. She mingled briefly, offering cold smiles and stiff handshakes, but she was no longer the center of attention. People didn't flock to her, they gravitated away. She stood alone near the snack table, watching the laughter she no longer controlled. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. That night I received a message from one of the board members. "Keep doing what you're doing. Change is overdue." It wasn't just a pat on the back, it was a sign of shifting power. Karen had ruled for years through intimidation and bureaucracy. But now the tide was turning. People were speaking up, asking questions, taking back the HOA one step at a time. As I cleaned up with a few volunteers, I looked down the block. Lake Ranch Estates was quiet again, but something fundamental had shifted. People had remembered what community meant. They had seen what that happened when someone stood up, not with anger, but with facts, grace, and a refusal to be bullied. Karen's grip was loosening, and no amount of paperwork could fix it. But I knew her. She wasn't going down without a fight. The next phase wouldn't be public, it would be subtle, political, strategic. She would try to isolate me, discredit me, find angles I hadn't considered, but I was ready. I had a support system. I had a father who wore a badge and a mother who saw 10 moves ahead, and I had something Karen never counted on: momentum. This wasn't personal anymore. This was a battle for how people chose to live. With fear or with freedom, with rules weaponized or rules respected. And as much as Karen tried to twist the narrative, more and more people were waking up. They weren't just following, they were watching. And some of them were ready to lead. Karen had fired the first shot, but I had taken the first stand. And now, the community was responding. Not with torches and pitchforks, but with lawn chairs and open eyes. The story of Lake Ranch Estates was changing. And Karen, she was no longer the author. I was writing the next chapter, and so were my neighbors. The war wasn't over, but the battlefield had changed. And for the first time in a long while, it felt like we might actually win. Autumn came quickly. 2 Lake Ranch Estates. and with it a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The block party had lit a fire among the residents, but Karen's absence from the conversation afterwards spoke volumes. Her silence wasn't surrendered, it was strategy. She was regrouping, calculating. And it wasn't long before we saw what she had in store. It started subtly. New security cameras appeared around the clubhouse, pointed not at the building but at the street. HOA emails doubled in length, filled with vague warnings about unauthorized gatherings and threats to order. Karen no longer mentioned names. She didn't need to. Everyone knew the target. I had stepped onto her chessboard, and now she was countering quietly but precisely. My mailbox was the next casualty. One morning I found it slightly askew, the pole bent. Not enough to cause alarm, just enough to require repair. A note inside read, HOA will inspect for code violations within 72 hours. No signature. I fixed it before the deadline, documented everything, and submitted a written response. It was annoying, yes, but nothing I couldn't handle. Karen was poking the bear. Then she tried to take my dog. It was a rainy Tuesday when I got the notice, unregistered pet reported. Immediate action required. I stared at the document, stunned. Max, my golden retriever, was registered with both the HOA and the county. He had been for years. The accusation came with no evidence, just a demand. I took photos of Max's tags, copied his vet records, and sent them with a politely firm email. 3 hours later I got a reply not from Karen, but from a newly appointed compliance coordinator, a man named Greg Winters, who no one had heard of before. He attached a 3-page document outlining Max's supposed infractions, leash length discrepancies, barking complaints, and failure to file monthly activity logs. Activity logs. For a dog, this was no longer HOA enforcement. It was harassment. Greg was Karen's new puppet, the public face of her escalating war. He wore a tie to inspect garden beds and carried a clipboard like it was a badge. Within a week, he'd cited 6 residents for violations no one had ever heard of. People were rattled. Karen had found a workaround, someone else to do her dirty work, but if she thought I'd go quietly, she was mistaken. I started documenting everything, every notice, every inspection, every interaction. I filed FOIA requests with the county to verify Greg's credentials. Turns out, he wasn't an HOA employee, he was a private contractor, paid through a discretionary maintenance budget. A budget Karen controlled. That was a smoking gun. I gathered the evidence and shared it with the entire neighborhood. My neighbors were stunned. Greg's legitimacy evaporated overnight. People started pushing back, requesting meeting transcripts, auditing HOA spending. A quiet rebellion spread across our cul-de-sac. Karen doubled down, issuing cease letters to those she called instigators. But the momentum had shifted. People weren't afraid anymore. They were angry and organized. Then the real blow came. A lawyer from the County Housing Commission contacted me. Apparently, several formal complaints had been filed against Karen's HOA leadership, and my case had been flagged for review. They asked for documentation. I handed over everything: notices, recordings, Greg's payment trail. They thanked me and said an inquiry had been launched. Karen's empire was under audit at the next HOA meeting. The energy had changed. Karen arrived late, her smile tight, her blazer uncharacteristically wrinkled. She stood at the podium and tried to speak, but murmurs drowned her out. Hands shot up. People demanded answers. Why is a contractor enforcing rules? Where's the money going? Why haven't we voted on any of this? She stammered, then declared the meeting adjourned. The walk to my car that night was quiet but tense. Greg stood near the exit, trying to look important. I nodded at him. He didn't nod back. Instead, he scribbled something on his clipboard and walked off. I laughed under my breath. Paper warriors don't scare me, especially not when the ink is smudged and the army behind them is shrinking. The following week, Greg vanished. No explanation, no announcement, just gone. His citations were quietly dismissed, his name scrubbed from the HOA contact list. A whispered rumor claimed the audit had forced Karen to dissolve the contract. Whether true or not, it didn't matter. Her firewall was gone, and she was exposed. One by one, residents began telling their own stories. Karen's threats, late-night calls, policy changes without consent. For years she'd ruled with bureaucratic shadowboxing, but now the spotlight was on her, and shadows don't survive in light. The board began considering a recall vote. Petitions circulated. Karen tried to spin it as a smear campaign. No one was buying it. My dad stayed mostly silent during all this. He watched from the sidelines, offering advice only when I asked. But one night, after dinner, he said something that stuck with me. This isn't just about rules, Caleb. It's about leadership. People don't follow papers, they follow example. I nodded. He was right. I hadn't just followed the rules, I'd shown people they could stand up to. Then came Karen's final gambit. A glossy newsletter, mailed to every home, titled, "The Truth About Our Neighborhood." It was 8 pages of spin, painting me as a disruptor, accusing me of inciting division, even hinting I had political ambitions. She framed her leadership as a necessary firmness and warned residents against falling for charisma over commitment. It was dramatic, desperate, and Ineffective. My rebuttal came not in paper but in presence. I walked door to door. I answered questions. I didn't make promises. I listened. Residents were tired of the drama. They didn't want a war. They wanted peace, fairness, and someone who actually lived by the rules they enforced. I wasn't campaigning, but I was standing firm. And they noticed a special election was announced. Karen's presidency would be voted on openly, officially, and soon. It was unprecedented in our neighborhood. Flyers went up. Debates were scheduled for the first time. HOA politics looked like real politics. Karen's allies dwindled. Mine grew organically. Because I wasn't seeking power. I was seeking accountability. The night before the vote, I stood on my porch and looked out across Lake Ranch Estates. Lights glowed in windows. Laughter carried faintly from across the street. Despite the chaos, the place still felt like home, and that's what this was all about, keeping that sense of belonging intact, not for control. For community. Karen had escalated. She'd gone from paper cuts to PR campaigns, but in doing so, she'd revealed her weakness. When power is built on fear, it only takes one person standing up to shake the whole foundation. And that's exactly what we'd done. One step at a time, with facts, patience, and courage. Tomorrow, the votes would be cast. The neighborhood would speak, and whatever the outcome, one thing was certain: Karen would never hold power the same way again. Because now, she wasn't the only voice in the room, and people had finally remembered that they had the right to speak. Election day dawned gray and misty, the sky heavy with low clouds and tension. The streets were unusually quiet, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. A folding table had been set up near the clubhouse entrance, manned by 3 neutral board members tasked with overseeing the vote. Clipboards, pens, and a clear ballot box sat beneath a sign that read, HOA Special Recall Vote. Residents trickled in one by one, clutching coffee cups and eyeing each other with cautious optimism. Some nodded at me as they passed. A few offered words of encouragement. Karen arrived mid-morning, dressed sharply in a navy pantsuit with her usual pearl necklace, projecting calm and confidence, but her eyes betrayed her. They darted too quickly, scanning the crowd, measuring loyalty. I stood to the side, not campaigning, just present. I wasn't on the ballot, it was her leadership in question, but everyone knew this vote was a referendum on her entire regime. People whispered as they waited in line, trading stories, recalling violations, remembering how they'd felt small, silenced. This wasn't just an election. It was therapy, vindication, and justice all rolled into one. As noon approached, the line stretched farther than anyone had anticipated. A neighbor brought out water bottles. Someone else set up a speaker playing quiet music. What began as a tense gathering had become a community event. No shouting, no signs, just people calmly, steadily taking back control. Karen paced near the clubhouse steps, clipboard in hand, smile frozen like a mask. My parents showed up around 1 p.m. Dad gave me a pat on the shoulder. Win or lose, he said, you've changed this place. Mom squeezed my hand. You reminded people what respect looks like. Their support meant more than any ballot. I watched them cast their votes, proud and quiet, before they melted back into the crowd. Karen watched too, jaw clenched so tightly I could almost hear it. By mid-afternoon, nearly every household had cast their vote. The board decided to close the polls early due to high turnout. They announced the results would be read aloud at sunset. Karen disappeared briefly into the clubhouse. No one followed her. No one needed to. The decision was no longer hers to influence. The power had shifted. It belonged to the people now. Sunset came slowly, spilling golden light across the lake and rooftops. The crowd reassembled, larger now, buzzing with anticipation. The ballot box was brought out. 3 board members stood shoulder to behind the folding table. One cleared her throat, opened the lid, and began the count. Each vote was marked aloud, tallied in real time. No secrecy, just transparency. Remove ... remove ... stay ... remove ... The words fell like hammer strikes. Karen stood near the back, arms folded, lips pressed into a thin line. With each remove, her posture stiffened. By the halfway mark, it was clear where things were heading. A few gasps broke through the silence. Someone in the back whispered, "It's done." And then came the final count. Total ballots cast: 123 votes to remove, 97 votes to retain, 26. A beat of silence, then applause. It wasn't raucous, just steady and full of release. People smiled, a few cried. Karen didn't move. One of the board members stepped forward, effective immediately. Karen Kessler is removed as HOA president. The special election for new leadership will be held next month. Karen turned slowly and walked away. No speech, no protest, just the click of her heels on concrete as the sun dipped below the horizon. Her reign had ended not with fireworks but with facts, ballots, and quiet resolve. I felt a strange mix of triumph and pity. She had built a castle of control, and it had collapsed from within. People lingered long after talking and reconnecting. Plans for the future began bubbling up, ideas for more inclusive meetings, transparency reforms, community events. For the first time in years, Residents felt like they had a say. Not because they shouted the loudest, but because they showed up, listened, and voted. Real power had returned to the block. That night, I sat by the lake alone. Max rested beside me, head on my boot, watching the moon ripple across the water. I thought about everything that had led to this Karen's threats, the paperwork, the games, and all it took to change it was one decision. To stop being silent. My victory wasn't just personal, it was communal. And it was just the beginning. The next day brought cleanup, but also opportunity. With the board in transition, residents formed committees, voluntary groups with real input. I joined the communication task force. We created an HOA email transparency policy, posted monthly budgets online, and opened meetings to live. No more backroom decisions. No more secret power plays. Karen's supporters quietly faded away. Some apologized, some just stopped showing up, and that was okay. This wasn't about punishment, it was about balance. Karen herself didn't move out. She stayed, quieter now, keeping to herself. I sometimes saw her watering her hydrangeas or walking alone by the lake. Her crown was gone, but she was still a neighbor, and neighbors deserve a second chance. The special election came and went. A retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Ellison was elected president. She was calm, wise, and known for settling disputes with cookies. The mood in Lake Ranch changed tangibly. Less tension, more barbecues, less surveillance, more smiles. The air felt lighter, like we'd finally taken a collective breath. Looking back, I realized the real win wasn't just removing Karen, it was awakening the neighborhood, reminding people that rules should serve people, not the other way around, that fear has no place in a place called home, and that even in the smallest communities, leadership matters, not for power but for trust. Chapter 4 had closed the book on Karen's presidency, but it had opened a new one for Lake Ranch Estates, and I had a feeling the best chapters were yet to come.